Friends, well, whether you're joining us in person or if you're joining us online, I would like to welcome you to St. Andrew's United Church here at Yonge and Bloor. My name is Morgan Bell, and along with Reverend Neil Young, I'm one of the ministers here. And we are super delighted to have with us the Reverend Dr. Natalie Wigg-Stevenson, who I will further introduce in a moment. But first, I just want to make a couple notes. If you're new to the church, there's bathrooms just out. If you walk out of the sanctuary to your right, you'll find some bathrooms there. And we acknowledge that we gather on territory that's traditional to the Huron, Wendat, and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And we acknowledge that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is a sacred agreement for the Ojibwe and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes Basin. And we lament all the ways that we continue to forsake that treaty and to break it, and we strive to make right with all our relations. So Natalie.
Yes.
Well, that wasn't a question. I was just going to introduce you.
But you said it to me,
Yes.
so I thought it was for me. Please, go ahead.
So we are delighted to have Natalie with us. Natalie is the Associate Professor of Contextual Education and Theology at Emmanuel College, which is a United Church-affiliated theological school at the University of Toronto. Natalie is an ordained Baptist minister. She's a graduate. She's a graduate of Vanderbilt University, that august institution, and she's the author of 2 books. The first one is called Ethnographic Theology, so literally wrote the book on her discipline. And then the second just came out last year, I suppose, correct?
I think 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's called Transgressive Devotion, Theology as Performance Art. And if I'm on the ball, I have some quotes here that I'm going to pepper our conversation with. But it's an excellent read. I highly recommend it. And it is sold wherever fine books are sold. And if you are like me and you've sold your soul to Jeff Bezos, you can buy it on Kindle. Not one laugh. That's great. Why don't we start with a quick prayer?
Yes.
Okay. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you that we can worship you with our bodies and our hearts and our wills and our intellects. And so be with us now as we bend the knee of our intellect before you. Fill this place with your Spirit and guide us into closer communion with you. All this we pray in the name of the risen and living Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So tonight, we are considering the question, what is queer theology? And Natalie just happens to be a queer theologian and an expert in queer theology. Expert. So we're getting our money's worth, folks. So Natalie, can you tell us what is queer theology? What's queer about it? What's theological about it? I'll let you take it from there.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here and everybody online. Is that how we do this? Do we wave to the people online? It's great to be here with you tonight. Thanks for coming out. So I teach the first queer theology course that's ever been taught at the Toronto School of Theology, which is a little mind-boggling to me. But and the way that I try to explain it to my students is that this is a very different discipline than, say, doing what used to be called gay and lesbian studies, which were focused primarily on trying to create different kind of theological understandings that open the church up to inclusion of people who would embody some kind of queer identity. Queer theology differs from that, not that in that it's not affirming, it is affirming, but that's its baseline, and it moves quickly away from that in terms of trying to reimagine how we conceive of the divine through the kinds of language Christianity has always used to conceive of and relate with the divine. If we were to remove from that all the kind of heteronormative, all the kind of heterosexual underpinnings of all theological thinking. And then to reimagine with a wider diversity of human sexuality and gender diversity. That might sound, I'm not sure if that actually makes complete sense.
Yeah, so let's bring it down a level.
I'm not sure if it's bringing it down, but the thing that excites me about queer theology is that our desire for God is kind of at the heart of Christian faith. Our desire for and our yearning towards the divine is the core of how we love God. It's a drawing, it's a luring. God is always reaching towards us, and we are reaching back towards God. And that's, to me, at the heart of queer theology, this idea of desire for the divine that we then begin to understand in many, many different ways. If you think throughout Christian history of the ways desire for God has been understood, it's always had a very heterosexual orientation to it. And queer theology kind of takes that, affective orientation to the divine and begins to open it up to really think about all the ways that humans can experience desire and desire for God in ways that are, as the name goes, queered, among other things. Yeah, you look like you want to follow up.
I can.
Go for it.
No, actually, this reminds me of one of the quotes that I mined from your book in preparation for this. So a little edgy, but that's queer theology.
We're like 2 minutes in. Are we supposed to be edgy already?
Well, this is edgy in a different way. We'll get to the sexy, edgy stuff in a bit. So you've written in Transgressive Devotion that progressive Christianity's polite divine being wants to gently usher us into new modes of life together. What of the God who will batter my heart, who will enthrall me, force, break, burn, and imprison me? What of those bodies that yearn for destruction, for dissolution?
We just got started.
I know.
Morgan.
Well, we're kicking off.
Warm.
So,
Okay.
you talk about this affective dimension of theology, the divine pull, the lure, and those sorts of things. But you want to talk about those, it seems to me, on a fairly different level. So can you talk about some of your work in queer theory and how that helps us understand this affective orientation of theology, of Christian life? What does our desire and all of that have to do with a God who desires us?
Yeah, so part of what Morgan's pulling out here is that in this book I wanted to push not just on sort of conservative, anti-queer kind of approaches to theology, but also on liberal approaches to theology as well that wanted to shy away from sort of the terror and the fear and the wonder and the majesty of God. And part of what had happened, at least in earlier classical feminist theologies, was this kind of moving away from any idea of God as sort of all-powerful. This became seen as sort of a sadomasochistic divine who just wanted to control us. And this quote from John Donne's poem, oh, you're so much better at John Donne than I am. What is the poem? Batter my heart,
three-person God.
Three-person God, yeah. It became kind of a touchstone piece that people would criticize of, well, John Donne wants to be beaten up by God, and therefore that's bad. And I was like, well, what if John Donne was actually just a little into something a bit more kinky, and was, it's not that he wants to be beaten up by God in a bad way, but maybe wants to enjoy a certain kind of awareness of the power dynamics between the divine and the human, and that this queerness, this kinkiness to the poem that he's writing actually lifts that up. And instead of saying we have to choose between God is either all-powerful and that's a terrible thing, or God is not really into power, me and God, we're kind of like the same. On the other side, there's this in queer theology, there's this interest in actually really heightening these power dynamics in the same way as happens in certain forms of kink and queer kind of play. And so I'm interested in using those kinds of approaches of thinking about power in a queered way to understand the divine-human relationship. I yearn for God. I yearn for God. I am a former charismatic evangelical, still kind of one, progressive, whatever. I don't even know what I would name myself as. But that old world I come from, they knew a really powerful, terrifying, and desiring God. And I don't want to let that God stay just there. I want to know that God from my progressive politics as well.
Well, and that's interesting from like another part of your book too, because we could sort of say, well, that's sort of weird charismatic Christianity as we would be wont to do in a progressive tradition. But it's more than just sort of contemporary charismatic Christianity, right? This goes back through the Christian tradition. So you've written a bit on Beatrice of Nazareth, who, for those of you who might not know, she's a 13th century Flemish nun, am I right? A Cistercian nun?
Yes.
Yes. If you see this on the internet later, can you Google it for us and then get back to us?
And then just put it in the comments if I just got it wrong.
That's right. And so you write this in your book about just these power dynamics and the mix of desire with them. So on Beatrice, you write, Eucharistic starvation, bodily restriction and bondage, piercing her flesh with thorns. Beatrice is known for her ruthless asceticism. She pursued discomforting mixtures of desire and violence, pleasure and pain, and spirit unleashed through broken flesh that presage the Marquis de Sade's dungeons and serve as templates for contemporary communities of BDSM practitioners. 50 Shades of Grey pales in comparison to Beatrice's piety. You want to unpack that, Natalie Wick-Stevenson?
Morgan said we were going to start kind of slow. I'm really worried about what's coming in the second hour. Yeah, well, there is a tradition throughout Christian history among who we typically would refer to as mystics or ascetics, people who take on these extreme bodily practices to form their bodies in a way that are open, transcendent to divine presence. And they always used incredibly erotic language that often gets cleaned up in translations or cleaned up by sort of the parameters that get put around the text when it's published. But at the heart of these stories are people just yearning to the point of self-destruction for the divine. And I'm not saying everyone needs to be this way in the same way that, like, it's okay.
Don't try this at home.
But there are practices these people have taken on throughout history that do look like contemporary kink practices in many ways, and there's a lot of philosophical work done on trying to look at the similarities among these, that are disciplining the body into forms of transcendence that open awareness and connection with the divine. But I mean, even right now, I'm sweating a little talking about this because I'm like, well, actually, maybe a lot of people don't like to get smacked around in the bedroom or at the pulpit, right? Not everybody is into that, and not everybody has to be. But what intrigues me are the ways in which these certain kinds of practices throughout history have enabled people to transcend their own, let's say, bodily or self-coherence in ways that open them up to the inexplicable, unexplainable, unimaginable. And I don't think everyone needs to be doing that. I mean, this is why queer theology is less about inclusion and trying to sort of draw everyone into a normative way of being, and much more about seeking to disrupt what our norms are, to see when we do that, what kind of possibilities open up for how we might relate to God. And so it's always a bit, I'm like thrown off a bit because we've jumped straight into the BDSM and kink, which I thought we were going to sneak in at the end. But the idea...
Lay it all on the table.
It's right out there. The idea here being is that we have these kinds of ways of thinking theologically, of constructing our Christian practice, of approaching God, that are shaped by certain kinds of parameters of what we might call decency, what the theologian Marcella Altuis-Reed calls decency. And that if we want to really unlock our theological imaginations to open up new ways of encountering the divine, it requires becoming indecent in a certain way. And that attached to sexual decency also come certain ideas of economic decency, colonial decency. We can list all the things that us good liberals care about decency. They're all sort of connected with each other, and when you can break open the sexual story, you become able to also break open all these other stories as well, that, like I say, open our theological imaginations for the possible. So what can be quite tricky, and I often forget to kind of frame when I'm talking about queer theology, and often I have TAs who help remind me that this part's important too when I'm freaking out students, that these are not suggestions for how one has to live. I'm not knocking them. I can see on some of your faces, some of you like these suggestions. It's a nice way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. But they're not only... It's Wednesday today, isn't it?
I'm going to have to find a new church tomorrow.
Not talking about what I did yesterday. You're pouring the water now. They're not suggestions for what you have to do. But they're ways of thinking about the divine. If we destabilize the kind of normative underpinnings of the ways we think about God, many new things become possible. And when we're thinking about God in different ways, we're relating to God in different ways. And for me, I'm always wanting to think about and relate to God through yearning. deep, deep and wild yearning, because I believe that God yearns deeply with great desire for me.
Yeah.
Us, not just me, but me. And you.
That's helpful, Natalie. And so, I mean, we did jump right into sort of the kinky BDSM stuff, right? But I think that helpfully kind of puts on the table that we are not about a decent enterprise tonight. It's kind of an indecent enterprise. But there's been some critique of queer theology precisely on that score. It's shock and awe for shock and awe's sake, right? What would you say to that? That there can be some pretty explicit messaging in queer theology. Some parts of your book, I did some interesting Google searches to be like, what is that? And let's just say I had to clear my browser history afterwards. But that has a purpose, I think you would want to argue. And what is the purpose of that, other than, disruption for disruption's sake? How do you do that in a judicious way, right? I'll let you go for that.
I think people do it, many queer theologians do it differently. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about queer theology that we've talked about, so Morgan was actually, I think you were still an MDiv student when I wrote the draft of this book. And yes. Morgan is one of the smartest students I've ever had and a really incredible reader. And so I gave him the draft and said, could you give me some feedback on this, please? And he gave me actually fairly intimidating feedback. It was very insightful. But one of his first...
I was terrified of Natalie for 4 full calendar years, so favor returned.
So nice. But one of the first things he said was, like, his generation has just had, I think, what was it, like a fire hose of sexuality thrown at you since you were born. He's like, but you're really orthodox. I had no idea. Like, the shock level for him, and it has been for other people as well in reading some of my work, is that I'm incredibly doctrinally orthodox. And that's kind of the bringing together of these really deep, historical, rich wisdom traditions with these potentially shocking ways that some people live their lives. It unlocks, I think, this new possibility of encounter. A lot of queer theologians do work with deeply traditional approaches to theology because they give us these kind of, those of you who do know about kink and BDSM will hear where this is going, but they give us these fairly strict structures and parameters that you can then rupture and rearrange in different ways to actually create spaces of performance, activity, creativity, where a divine encounter becomes possible. I'm not especially interested, and might be where I differ from some queer theologians, I'm not particularly interested in writing about God. I'm interested in writing spaces through which God will make Godself known. Am I doing that? Okay. So that rupture, what it does is it takes something really solid, breaks it apart to release the spirit, to create this transcendent moment of what's possible. I'm trying to think theologically, I don't want to shock you with BDSM, but there's something where if you went home and began to think about God's power and began to think of it along the lines of certain kinds of sexual practices that we never talk about in church, and that are certainly not sanctioned by church, then it would start to ripple out and begin to have a systematic effect on the way that you think about God. That's what I'm looking for, something that is powerful enough to actually rearrange the whole system we have moving subconsciously in our minds and under the surface of our bodies to see what can happen when you rearrange it.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like, especially if you look at the uptake in some churches, I think people are attracted to the queer stuff because they might see themselves represented in that move, but also there's this destabilizing current to queer theology, right? There is that disruption, there is that contestation and the rearranging. But from what you're saying, there's also a consolidation, right? There's also a putting back together, a inhabiting the tradition in a way that people might think is pretty unusual for someone writing about BDSM or bug chasing or whatever it might be. I brought it in. We won't explain. Could you talk about that? Like, what are the norms for that consolidation, right? How do we actually figure out what are we going to keep and put back together? Because, you were talking about John Donne. It is a 3-person God that you want to be battered by, you've written a pretty orthodox Christology, even if you use Friedrich Schleiermacher. Like I said, in many ways...
Too big of a laugh for a Schleiermacher joke.
This is how you know that you're a nerd, friends. So like, what are your norms for figuring out what stays, what gets inhabited, what gets reconsolidated, what's worth keeping?
Nothing is ever left forever, and nothing ever stays forever. The way that I think about the norms are that the consolidations are fleeting, they're fragmentary. I'm always held, I don't know, this is what we were talking about beforehand. For me, scripture and the theological traditions, historical theological traditions, have absolute authority on the way in which I think about God and relate to God. The way in which that authority functions might be different than the way we expect that authority to function. The authority is there in terms of I cannot throw anything away, but the wrestling with it is what is required. And when I'm doing that wrestling, I'm thinking along the lines of an approach to theology that's very aesthetically based in terms of kind of pulling together these orthodox ideas for a moment and then letting them release. Everything sounds sexual when you're talking about queer theology, but they contract, they release, they come together, they do some magic. Like there's an ebb and flow, and theology is not something that is static. It's something that is continually producing and reproducing itself. And as the theologian, I see myself as someone just a part of that wheel as it turns, and one who is kind of moving the pieces around as they go. It sounds like that could be either completely dogmatic or entirely in full-on relativism, depending on like which side of annoyance at this kind of stuff you stand on. But I would say that is the life of the Spirit, and that we are continually sort of in this cycle of trying to approach the divine using these resources, these tools of thousands, 2,000s and then thousands upon thousands of years of wisdom that we draw on as Christians.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting too, given that, there might be some people who see queer theology, pick up a book by you or a Lynn Tonstad or Marcella Authas Reed and say, this is straight up heresy. I think harder to do with a Lynn Tonstad maybe than an Authas Reed. But what I think those critiques fail to consider is just how open and porous our doctrinal inheritance is, right? So Christians would say, we had the Council of Chalcedon, right? And that's where the church said with sort of authority that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and he has two natures. They don't mix, they're not confused, there's no overlap, but absolutely no word whatsoever about how they do interact. So it says, here's a very loose framework on how not to think about Jesus, but that leaves a whole world to think about Jesus, right? It licenses further reflection, and it seems to me that you want to inhabit queer theology right in that space, saying that this is more of an ecosystem than a system, right? This is more of a baseboard upon which to build than a ceiling that we must remain in, right? Even if we might have to do a new subfloor every once in a while.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so when I think about these sort of, Chalcedonian rules, I think of them less as sort of the rules that hold us in, beyond here you cannot go. They're actually a set of, what's it called when you hang a picture on a wall? No, you hang a, oh God, I'm sorry, I have to share it. So Morgan and some other people know that I'm recovering from a concussion right now, and so some words are just not coming to my mouth when I need them. I've also developed a bit of a stutter, and some thinking is a bit hard. So this is not a castanet. This is a little.
Now I look like a jerk, eh?
It's a little anchor you put in the wall to hang your pictures on, is what I was going for there. Yeah, so we've got a set of questions that we ask every time we talk about Jesus. And it's a failure of imagination, I think, when Christians say, you know what? I just don't think he was divine. He's just human. He's a good guy, and I've got a lot to learn from him as a good guy. I'm not sure he was a good guy. I mean, he did a lot of really weird and sometimes mean stuff. So to me, it's not like, do you pick human or divine? Do you pick nature, whatever? This is a set of questions that we continually ask ourselves through time. And the normative frame for me is that these are the questions. I cannot escape these questions. When I'm talking about Jesus, I got to figure out human and divine and how, and what does that mean? When we're talking about two natures, well, okay, but they didn't say what natures were. They don't say what a self is. These questions get asked differently in every generation, and they get answered differently in every generation, depending on what we think a self is, depending on what we think, any other philosophical concept that's at the heart of the moment these rules were made up. I'm less interested in saying, oh, that was a whatever century, and so therefore I don't need to do that anymore because times have changed, and instead saying, they came up with this little set of criteria, and those guys were my ancestors. They were my ancestors in Christ. And they gave me a set of really good questions to keep asking in different contexts. And so I want to take those ancient questions and ask them now in light of gender diversity that we are beginning to understand, in light of sexual diversity, in light of practices around desire, less interested in identities and more interested in practices. How through certain practices do we become shaped as lovers of God? That's what excites me, and that's what I think those ancient questions, they become authoritative for me because they give me something outside of myself and outside of my time and outside of my space to keep asking questions I would never think of on my own. They bind me to something that I wouldn't choose in and of my single selfness. They push me into ways of relating that I wouldn't pick on my own.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Well, and then you talk...
To add, in a good way.
In a good way.
If you get pushed.
Well, and so you talk about practices, right? And that puts us into our everyday lives, right? And we are made by our practices as Christians, right? And so what do you think queer theology and its attention on these sort of practices that form us, right? What does that have to do with the church, right? Because we can talk about like Lee Edelman and queer negativity and anti-futurity and all of these sorts of things. And that's great that we have people who think that, right? What does that mean for the church, right? Why would churches care about queer theology? What would a queer theology in practice look like in a congregation?
That's a great question. I mean, why are you here tonight? Okay, we're doing this sort of esoteric thing of talking about queer theology tonight. You probably would get more people if we were having a town hall on how to be more inclusive, because that's where the church's conversations are mostly happening. And again, very, very important conversations. I cannot state enough how much I think it's important for churches to be inclusive and affirming. The queer theological conversation often doesn't happen in the everyday life because it's the place where it wants to be more disruptive of that. So I teach queer theology to my students because I have students coming in who think that being inclusive and affirming is the end of the story. We've done that now. We've put on our pride flag. We're good, let's go. And I want to work with students to say, you know what, actually, things are changing constantly. You need tools to be thinking beyond. We've decided to let this narrow, understood group of particular queer people into the church, provided they get married, provided they do this, that, and they don't talk about this or that. Queer theology is trying to be more continually disruptive than that. Queer not as an identity, but as a verb, as a continual challenge to a form of sexual status quo and gendered status quo. So I don't know how well it sort of slides quickly into everyday church life, because I think it's a lens, a critical lens on trying to disrupt us when we think we've made it. Queer is to queer. It's to make strange what we have accepted as no longer strange. I'm trying to think about how to pull that back into my mouth so it doesn't sound offensive, or to add the words to make it sound less offensive, but it's an attempt to continually push and say, don't get comfortable thinking you figured it out. There's someone you're still forgetting. There's something you're still forgetting. There's something that's still possible. There's something that's still open. And for inclusion, but also, again, for relating to God. There are things happening in people's lives that we don't know about, where like they're having these wild encounters with the divine, and this widening of our understanding of sexuality opens up space for that. So I don't think I sort of, like, my students will often say, well, how am I going to preach that? I'm like, I don't know how you're going to preach that. Like, it's not...
You're the student, you figure it out. Yeah.
It's not direct from here to the pulpit, but if I'm helping to equip ministers who are thinking in much more expansive and disruptive ways about sexuality, then they're going to be, like I do when I preach, dropping little things into the sermon that might not sound like they're about sex or identity or gender, but are, again, sort of thinking about desire, thinking about ecstasy, right? Who thinks about ecstasy anymore in church? I'm always trying to preach ecstasy. I want to unlock and overflow and pour out and spill all over the place. I don't know if you're into that at St. Andrews, but that's the stuff that's been shaped by my queer theological imagination. It's a more ecstatic relationship with the divine. I think that's where it comes into daily church life, of giving people permission to overflow, be too much.
Well, and I think, the other thing too with queer theology and using that as kind of a framework for church life, for our own theological thought, our own practices and that sort of thing, is that what is now indecent will at some point probably become decent, and then the goalposts shift, right? And so, like you said, it's a constant state of vigilance. And yet, at the same time, and I remember having a class with you in first year, I think it was context of ministry or something like this, and you made us watch I won't say what movie it was, but you made us watch a fairly interesting movie with Ryan Gosling, if you remember.
That one. I was thinking of a much worse one. No, that one was fine.
And it was interesting because I think what you were trying to get us to see in this movie that was a little bit avant-garde in some respects.
Well, it was 10 years ago.
Yes.
I don't use it anymore because it's so naive now.
But I think what you were trying to have us see was that we actually do have boundaries. We actually do have norms. And the fact that norms and boundaries exist, and there is, we all have our own decencies, right? So we can't pretend that we're not. We can only draw our circle so wide. And for everyone who sort of wants to say, oh, we don't have a circle, you do. But to subject them continually to kind of this queering process, right? Is there anything given to these norms, right? What's the importance of these norms? Why do we have them?
Yeah, I wanted to get students thinking about what their edge was. So, someone help us. What's the name of this movie where Ryan Gosling has an affair with a real doll?
Lars and the Real Girl.
Lars and the Real Girl. Oh.
No, it's good.
So I was using that 12 years ago when I first came to Emmanuel, and back then it was quite radical. He's having this relationship with this doll, and sorry, do you all know the movie? Okay, some do.
Consider yourselves lucky.
Oh my God, it was one of Ryan.
It was weird.
Well, I stopped using it because it just seems too normative at this point. But and the church is the most embracing community in this movie, which is quite lovely. And so we were talking about how the church becomes inclusive of this young man who's having a romantic relationship with a doll, a very realistic-looking doll. But so maybe it was after you, I began pairing it with a documentary about the men who do this in real life. And all of a sudden, the students who felt like they were so much more open-minded with the Ryan Gosling version had to face the real-life guys who were doing this. And then we got to see 5 of them who were doing it. And one was a very sweet story. A couple were upsetting. And all of a sudden, we had to start saying, okay, well, where's my edge? Right? If I'm okay with Ryan Gosling doing it, and in the Ryan Gosling movie, it is also like they start to use some pathologizing stuff around him that can explain it away. But what happens when we see that this is an actual sexual practice that some people engage? Then how does our inclusion become shaped and reimagined by that? Okay, I've gone down the real doll rabbit hole. I didn't know we were going to do this.
I think
So asking students to actually name not what are my norms so much, but how do I know when I've hit them? How do I articulate them, and how do I use them? When I've decided that something is beyond my boundaries of comfort, why? And then if you can begin to understand why you're applying a yes or a no to a certain point, then you can begin to understand how that might shift as well. And so I was trying to find like a very uncomfortable edge for every student. I sort of had to stop doing it because when your goal is to like make everybody uncomfortable in a different way, it got problematic. But we did learn a lot about where we put our edges and why.
Yeah. No, and I'm just looking at something else that you've written about, indecent theology not being about inclusion. And yeah, you said, indecent narratives do not therefore critique theologies that we might deem problematic. Instead, they critique the theologies that good liberal progressives hold dear. Rupturing the heterosexual matrix entails nothing short of dismantling the very foundations of theology so that we can imagine and, more importantly, perform God anew. So you're not United Church, but you're United Church adjacent. You train United Church ministers. You're even friends with some United Church people.
Some of my best friends are United Church.
Some of my best friends are United Church. And theologians, you have an ecclesial office, right, to speak to the church. And so if you could kind of peer into the United Church from your comfy little cottage next door, what do you see as some of the growing edges when it comes to our more liberal forms of inclusion, especially when it's Pride Month, right? We've been doing that since the 80s, and that's been good work and hard work and long work. What do you think our growing edges are? So it's one thing to say, well, you need to queer and you need to push and, lean into the indecency. How do you see that working out in the United Church? Yeah.
Because you were citing Marcella Altos Reed there and Theologies of Decency and Indecency, and it might be helpful actually to give you a story about how she did her work. So Marcella Altos Reed,
Argentinian.
Thank you. Argentinian theologian, only female theologian really in her group, and she was working sort of at the heyday of liberation theology in Latin America, and paying attention to how these base ecclesial communities had been formed, and then...
What are those?
Oh, they're like... Can you help me? There's sort of groups of liberation-oriented Christians in Latin America living together, all Catholic, right? Yeah. And this is where the idea came from that God has a preferential option for the poor. And this was like a sort of a mind-blowing idea in the 60s, 70s? And so now she would go to these communities and would see that they were beginning to be constructed to be able to basically procure economic goods that the poor people living in these communities needed by telling a certain version of what it means to be poor to a larger Christian audience. And so the church in the West then could begin to financially support these communities. The theology coming out of these communities was a disruption to the colonial underpinnings of most Western theology. Most. I don't know why I'm hedging that. All Western theology. And what she began to see was, okay, but we're telling a very particular story of what it means to be poor. And if we're going to be able to get these resources coming in to support these people who are poor, then we have to tell a version of the story that is decent. We cannot tell a story in which there are queer people in these communities. At the time, she would have said things like transvestites or cross-dressing in these communities, people who were partying all night in the bar with a crucifix in their pocket. These are not the stories from these communities we can tell, because that's not going to be the kind of theology that people want to hear from the global South. And so what she did was she started writing the stories of what she called the sexually poor, people who were marginalized because of their sexual identities, practices, and how that intersected with their economic disadvantage as well. And what she did was try to expose the ways in which theological decency forms the stories we tell about ourselves and each other, to make it palatable and acceptable. So when she was bringing shock in by telling stories about foot fetishists washing each other's feet, for example, you can read it as a shocking story, but what she wants to do is show this angle on poverty that completely changes the larger theological narrative around poverty. And she's saying you don't actually know what it's like to be poor if you're only understanding poverty along these lines of decency. So the shock was not just to stress people out, but was to show the paucity of their theology as it was being done. So what's the growing edge? I think the growing edge is to look at when we think we're doing something really great, like being inclusive and being affirming, how are we telling the story of who is being included to make it decent? And in that, how are we telling an untrue story? And when we tell something that's not true, we tell something that is limiting our capacity to encounter the divine. And so what I would think, following Marcella Altos Reed, my hero, is I want to keep pushing on the decency of inclusion, because when inclusion is decent, it is assimilation. You're included if you still look 70% like the rest of us. but not so much if you want to do X, Y, or Z. And so pushing on the decency of inclusion, I think that's what queer theology is always trying to do.
Reminds me of a conversation. I think we've had this conversation a few times, Neil, but about the Bob Cratchit stereotype that we have in our mind, that we want to help people on the streets, and we want to help the poor, so long as they look like Bob Cratchit and have 3 clean kids and they have patches on their clothes, but they're clean and well behaved, and that I've never met those people because they don't exist, right? I had another follow-up question there, Natalie Wake-Stevenson, and I forget what it was.
Do you need a minute to think? I don't want you to feel rushed.
No, do you want a minute to talk while I think about it?
I don't know, what shall I talk about? Does anyone have... I would like... No, you want to keep talking. I am curious to know why you would show up to an evening on queer theology.
I'll run a microphone.
You could shout. There's not that many.
Well, they're not going to hear. Frankie. So the people can hear.
I just wanted to know what it was.
What was?
Queer theology.
Oh, you feel like you still don't know?
No, that's why I showed up. I wanted to know what it was.
I forgot I asked you a question instead of you asking me one. Okay. Yeah, no, that's right. So why did you want to know what it was?
Oh, sorry. I'm a lead singer, so I grew up anyway. I'm going to pass on that question. Okay. Yeah. Just because it's on a microphone.
Other folks?
I wanted to know what queer theology is or was, or what the definition is, or what's included, not included. I just want to learn stuff. And I have friends who are in one of those alphabet things, LGBT, etc. And I just want to understand. So there you go.
Is this satisfying so far? Do you feel like we're meeting that hope? Or
Pardon?
do you feel like we're meeting that? Is it satisfying so far?
I'm not sure. The discussion is narrower than I thought it would be. But I'm still learning stuff, so it's okay.
I'm glad it's okay, but we'll try and broaden then.
Well, and I think you sort of opened this up, right? So it's, we focus on sort of LGBTQ rights, inclusion or not, sexual practices, or kind of the realm of sexuality. But what you've just presented, like queer theology blows open a lot more than just sexual decency, right? Or sexual practices or Christian sexual norms. Now, you talked about like an economic upshot, right? That Marcella Authas-Reed is looking at the sexually poor and saying, like, we're telling a very specific story about poverty that is brushing aside a huge swath of people. What other sort of, I'm loath to say applications, right? But where else, what other trajectories do you think queer theology opens up for us, right? Because potentially it could open up everything, right? But what do you see as some of the major things that it opens up if we want to go wide?
Well, one of the areas in queer theory that's most interesting to me is thinking about how we understand time through what we would call a heteronormative lens.
Okay, you said you were not bringing up time. I want
to... Okay. So a lot of queer theory is happening in places like literary theory, art theory. So there's not necessarily like a body of the queer theory so much as in different disciplines, scholarly disciplines, people are trying to queer, meaning disrupt, reimagine, change, bring these sexual lenses to their particular discipline. And as they do that, as we do that, we've begun to find all the many different ways in which this idea of a heterosexual nuclear family shapes so many of the ways that we move through the world, and so many of the ways we understand what it is to be in a human body in the world, be a human body in the world. So one is time. One is how we relate to time. There's the idea that like this forward drive of time, sort of this heterosexual intersection with capitalism that is always kind of pushing us into a certain set of sexual and economic norms. The disruption to that kind of drive is interesting to me because it removes the idea that things are always getting better, that we're progressing towards something better, that what we should be doing is producing, whether we're producing products or babies. I find that interesting because in Christian history we've also had a very wacky relationship to time. We live between a beginning and an end, and the end is somehow punctuating the space between the beginning and the end and reshaping it as it goes. We are time travelers as Christians, and
Someone tweet that, please. Yeah.
So we need different ways to think about time, to be faithful Christians. I think that we do. We have promises of what's possible, but it's not among us yet. There's a tension in our life. That is an understanding of how it means to live in time that is very different than the dominant understanding of our culture. And it's fascinating to me that queer theorists are finding the same, playing with the same ideas to think about how do we live in time differently. This is something Christians should be thinking about. Queer theology is exploring this and thinking, how do we relate to the traditions that shape us as Christians? How do we relate to the cultural context that we're in? How are we relating or not relating to the future? Where even is the future? These are the kinds of questions it's stirring up. Again, they don't preach directly, I don't think, but you got to think about time if you're a Christian. I think you do. Do you?
I think you do.
You do. I think
do.
you do.
Yeah.
We have a liturgical year. I mean, we've always done time differently
Yeah.
than everybody else.
Well, explore that connection, the liturgical year time. All that. I mean, time is not something that we often think about all the time, right? Frankie's putting her hand up. Yeah. Yeah. So is the question like, where did queer theology come from? Yeah? Yeah.
So I feel like there's a couple of answers. One would be that the Christian tradition has always been queer. And we can look back throughout it and see.
No, I was going to tell a story, but we're not going there.
Okay, we'll come back to that. That there have been there's always been elements of sexuality and play and identity and gender throughout Christian theology. Queer theory was, I guess, like 80s, 90s is where that really started coming into play. A sort of a landmark moment would be Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, which really helped us reimagine gender in significant ways. And she was writing out of particular contexts, concrete contexts. She wrote quite a bit about drag, and used that to understand gender as something much more fluid and performative, not to mean not real, but something that is much more fluid and something we do rather than something we are or something we have. And that was a real watershed moment for queer theory because it just disrupted what we thought about gender completely. Not that she invented it, she was witnessing it and trying to put it into philosophy. And then the philosophy then sort of re-enters the culture. And then around the same time, you're getting like Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet, and the queer theory and gender theory are really coming together. Like they're developing at the same time because they have similar sets of questions. And so once you start to destabilize gender, then you start to destabilize this very narrow, highly structured understanding of the gender-sex desire relationship. And so once gender got loosened at the same time that people were beginning to affirm same-sex rights, existence, same-sex desire, that kind of stuff, then these are working in tandem, and then theologians began picking up. The early theological work would be much more focused on how do we make an inclusive church, how do we make an affirming church, but then it's gone in other directions as well.
Right. I mean, like you could say too that queer theology isn't really about apologetics, by which you might say that like I'm going to make a case that same gender marriage is actually cool. I'm a queer man. I should be able to get ordained. Like those sorts of arguments. it's not really doing those. It's not opposed to them per se, though maybe in their decencying forms, right? If it's trying to clean us up a little bit more and be like, no, we're actually still dirtbags, but you should ordain us anyway. But it's not so much trying to make this case to liberal Christians or conservative Christians for that matter. It's trying to focus on queerness and the God who encounters us in that queerness and sort of run with it intellectually. Is that an okay way of putting it?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's kind of two different political or theological moves. You always have to have movements that are around identity for acquiring rights for people who don't have them. I would never say don't do that. It's just a different. Some people like chocolate ice cream, some people like vanilla. I find that what draws me to queer theory and theology is this sort of reimagining of our relationship to God through a wider lens. And that's what most queer theologians are doing. They're rewriting, reimagining doctrine, rereading scripture when you remove or sort of mess with the sort of heteronormative piece to it, and you see what you couldn't see there before. But it happens in ways that are not necessarily affirming. Some of the more radical queer theology written by queer people is also wanting to be self-critical, to say like, I'm tired of defending myself to try to get into your club. I want to be with my people where we can be honest with each other about where we need to learn and grow. And so some of the work in queer theology has been around saying, this is a great argument. So like, you think of a lot of work around, we have to reread the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as a story of hospitality. It's not really about sex, it's about hospitality. Well, there's great stuff in queer theological work that shows the problems with that approach because it's displacing violence onto another set of people altogether, and how certain moves of inclusion, they require decency, but they also displace the violence that might be coming at me onto somebody else. And so to try to track like a self-critical lens on one's own community as well. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Does that answer the question? I don't know. Are there some other questions? I mean, we're sort of throwing a lot of different stuff out here. Yeah, Jeffrey.
No, it makes sense. It's a really good question. I'm just trying to think about how to answer it. Tell me the part where can you repeat that for the folks at home?
So you're kind of saying, if I'm hearing your question right, from theater spaces, there was this uptake in queer performances. Why is that, why did the church take so long? And then what does performativity look like for Christians? Am I hearing you right? I think you're going to have to define performativity,
Yep.
because I think
Yeah.
it's a tricky word, right? So it has so
No,
many different resonances.
I know, and the intellectual trajectory you've just laid before us is fascinating. So I'm trying to close it down a little bit so not be overwhelmed by it. So just in terms of the tracking, I would say all of these kinds of intellectual discourses are kind of bubbling up simultaneously. And so the stuff that's happening in theater is being picked up by theologians, is being picked up by gender theorists, it's being picked up across the board, because these scholarly disciplines are always kind of talking to each other. So it makes sense that there would be those resonances across them. When we're talking about performance or performativity, they're connected, but I'll talk about gender trouble, Judith Butler's understanding of gender performativity for a moment. And what she's trying to disrupt, I'm just gonna take a breath. Sorry. I can feel my stutter coming in. What she's trying to disrupt is the idea that we have a true gender that we then express. Like, I am at my core a woman, and I'm going to express that for you. And I can express it through my dress, through my talk, et cetera, et cetera. No, this is 90s, so I'm using language from the 90s. What Judith Butler says instead is that gender is not an act of expression, it's a performative act. It's not something we are, but something we do. And the way that we do our gender is that we are continually living amidst a whole set of gender norms, and we are citing them in the way that you would cite a scholarly article in a paper that you had to write in one of your classes. We're citing them. We're drawing them into our own way of performing that is dependent on the understanding of that citation, of that norm, but we're kind of gathering these norms up as we go, consciously, subconsciously, all the time as we're moving through the world. Now, for people who cite those norms in ways that very much cohere with their wider cultural meaning, life is easy. It's a lot easier. The more disconnect, and the language Butler would use for this is to say that you become intelligible. You become intelligible to others as you cite.
Recognize you, yeah.
Yeah, you can be recognized. And if you're intelligible, if you can be recognized, no one's going to beat you up. The less you can cohere with those gender norms in the society as you're citing them, as you live life, the more violence you will probably face because you are less intelligible. This is not a normative argument, it's a descriptive argument. What happens across time is that the norms shift as people cite them differently and perform them differently. And it's never that there's not something real or true about us. We're not pretending when we cite these norms. This is just in everything we do, everywhere we go, every breath we take, we are performing these norms intuitively most of the time. And help me out here. Am I going down the rabbit hole too hard here?
No, I think that's, you're laying it out helpfully, right? That we were talking about kind of dissolving and consolidating
Yeah.
before, and contesting and disrupting, but then also inhabiting and taking up. And that's sort of what happens with these gendered ways of moving in the world, right? So, yeah, you talked about the sort of usual stuff like clothing or hair or, dress. And that's one way, but even how you move your arms in a, quote, feminine way, right?
I move my arms in a masculine way. What do you...
Well,
I'm quite intentional about taking up a lot of space with my body all the time. I've practiced this for years. I refuse to be diminutive.
one could say hypothetically that if Natalie were to move her arms in a feminine way, there's nothing natural about that, right? You might be citing a way that you saw your mother move her body, or other women in your life and people who are coded that way, and that's where you sort of take up this gendered way of being, right? That's one very specific example. But like you said, it's intuitive. You're not conscious of it, right? And that's where I think performativity can get tricky, because when we say someone's performing, you're putting on an act, right? You think that you're thinking about doing something, and then you're doing it. But that's not quite what Butler means by performativity, is it?
Right, so for them it's not, there's not a fakeness to it. It's not that you're pretending that you're something you're not. It's that there never is a stable something that you are. What you are is always becoming. What you are is always being made through your actions in the world, including your gender falls into that as well. So this is destabilizing for approaches to thinking queerly that want to begin from born this way. Now, born this way.
Sorry, Lady Gaga.
I love Lady Gaga. I'm not dissing Lady Gaga, but the idea that like the truth of who I am, this is pushing people into situations where they kind of have to say that, and that there's I think Butler would say there's more of a fluidity to gender, that there's not a fixed way of understanding gender. It's that there's not a fixed way of understanding gender, right? I might truly feel a certain way. I might have a certain gender, perform a certain gender, but our understanding of gender is always fluid, is always changing. And that's what we're continually changing through our performance of it. I feel like I'm expressing this really poorly and performing it badly too. Does that make sense? I don't know if it's that one-to-one. I think what we're trying to do here is give a different way of describing reality that might cause some sort of a shift. And when you're having these shifts in how we understand reality, you can just like carry them into the church and use them in a new way. But I think this kind of gender performativity idea is now surrounding us in terms of our understanding of gender. As a fluid thing.
I mean, I would say kind of two things, I think. One, there's like a sociological level that we could talk about here. So if you're talking about gender or identity being constituted by, Butler would say kind of like a discursive community, right? So like a community with norms and expectations and ways of moving. The church is part of that, right? What it means to look like a woman or a man is impacted by the community that you belong to religiously, right? I think that's kind of intuitive for a lot of people, right? There's gender norms, there's gender roles, all of these sorts of things, fine. But this question about performativity, right? That we are what we are in doing what we are, right? One of Butler's famous lines is, there's no doer behind the deed, right? We're made in the doing. Sounds to me like a lot of Christian practices, right? Read through scriptures, right? There's a lot of disruption, and there's a lot of people becoming in the doing, right? I think of like the stories of Abraham, for instance, preaching on him on Sunday. Things like baptism, right? We talk about sanctification as regeneration, right? You're being molded and remade into who you are in Christ. That's not to say, again, like there's this one-to-one correspondence between what we would say theologically and what queer theorists are saying. I think that cheapens both accounts. However, that's not to say that there's a world of difference between them either, right? There's resonance, which is why people do something like queer theology, There's enough there to work with.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to name the church as one of these discursive spaces as well, and that I'm not sure it's participating in if we're thinking of the church as its own sort of like closed system, then I would want to question that as well, and that the church, and as I know you would too, the church is embedded in, connected through, constituted by, as it also in its moments helps constitute the wider society in which we live. And so the more that we begin to understand the fluidity of gender in the wider society, some churches are embracing that as well, right? You said I'm to the side of the United Church. I actually have a deep vocation to training ministers for the most progressive denomination that I've ever encountered. Like, this is a gift to me.
What I meant to say is that you're not yourself United Church.
I am technically not, but I have a deep vocation with and for the United Church, and I think it's the kind of space that already is affirming and inclusive in so many ways. And so I would want to think with communities that have already done that work about how to keep opening and challenging themselves towards something new, challenging ourselves towards something new. I'm a Baptist. I can't do that with my people. But this is the kind of place where that can happen. So I think we probably agree it feels like it happens way too slowly, but no, I mean it does. But that connection to the wider culture, I think theologically we're moving across these spheres all the time. Does that answer it?
I'm going to leave some space for some more questions, and there's lots to think about here, so I'm going to leave a perhaps uncomfortably long silence just to let people formulate what they may or may not like to say. I personally love awkward silence. So.
I do too.
Not that we're making that much of it right now.
I know. This is like where the YouTube people can like fast forward later. Frankie.
That's right. Have you been listening to the last hour? None of this was fully formed, Frankie.
Okay, so Frankie's asking a question about the relationship between queer theology and private and public in the way the church understands itself and spiritual practices. Yeah? Yeah, that's a great question. And I think part of what you tangentially helped me piece together there is that the relationship between Christian theology, because you took us back to the BDSM and kink stuff, putting Christian theology side by side with queer theory lifts the questions of each out to ask the other. And so, for example, in Christian theology, we've had a long-standing conversation around power, God's power, human power, God's agency, human agency, and kind of maybe needed some more resources for thinking about that. At the same time, in queer theory, you're getting questions arising about power and power differentials and how to think about power. Feminist theory having a lot of concerns about patriarchal power that became sort of kink shaming. And then in queer theory, moving into thinking about power through kink and BDSM practice. So this is where the conversation starts to become interesting, because you've got a set of sexual practices that think about power in a certain way and give us a lot of good material and theory and thinking and structuring to use then and bring to the divine human relationship, which is also a power and balanced relationship. So it's when you get these similar questions across the divide, they become helpful. This is how this relates to the public-private. So on the one hand, you could have a fantastic church movement for embracing kink-positive practices. I don't know, is there like a queer... There are kink Christian community dungeon places. Like there are places where you can go and have a community of Christians doing kinky stuff together. And
the bus leaves in front of the church at 9 o'clock.
no, they're sex clubs. They're sex clubs for Christians. And so, yes, that's one version of it. And then the private version can become, if you're a kink practitioner, maybe there's something in there that's helping you think through your relationship with God that would let you take on a new kind of power-laden prayer practice. If you're not a kink practitioner, there's still insight there for thinking about, I'm struggling with how I think about divine power in my own life, how I think about the agency of God and myself being an agent in relation to this being who has so much more power than I do. I've run out of resources for that, but look, here I can think about this kind of set of sexual practices that opens up new lenses for thinking about that. That might be something that someone takes on in their own private prayer life as well. So there's the public and the private can run across all of this, but the idea that we're having different resources to support the questions these different communities are asking is, I think, something that we've missed saying out loud so far.
Well, and I won't go into specific practices that you talk about, but in the book, you're pretty clear that you're hey, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that are not my practices, right? But even the theory that's coming out of them, I find very helpful. So how do you do that? How does that happen responsibly then, right? Because it could become that I'm just dabbling in someone else's practices, dabbling in someone else's thought, and then taking it for my own, and then taking it out of context. So what does that look like in terms of responsible theology and then responsible practice?
Do you mean for the theologian in the book or for the Christian practitioner who's thinking about taking up some kinky prayer?
The world's your oyster, Natalie.
So in the book, I make sure I'm engaged with people who are writing and researching and doing work in this area to make sure it's anchored not in my own imagination about what might be happening or deploying my own purely subjective experience of certain practices. In the Christian life, we always have to ask these questions of cultural appropriation, and we have different frameworks for how to do that we need to figure out. I think consulting the wisdom of practitioners is an important part of that. And so there are tons of resources for people wanting to think about different queer practices in a way that's not sensationalizing or exoticizing of them, but actually listening to people who do these practices and what it means for them, right? Don't go to 50 Shades of Grey. Go to real kink practitioners. We're so close to Church Street. Go to a workshop. There's communities that we can learn from and be in relationship with or be committed members of that can expand our understanding in ways that, again, are not like the 50 Shades version. But, if something's ignited your imagination tonight about BDSM and prayer, there are resources out there for you to consult.
I know a book.
Recommending. So, you can, it's what's captured your imagination, but dive into your own, explore yourself. I cannot believe this is how this is coming out. What are your fantasies? What excites you that you don't say out loud to people? I'm not going to pass around the mic, but how is your desire constituted in ways that aren't sanctioned by the church? What do you think about when you're not allowed to be thinking about that thing? And if that's how your desire works, what does that tell you about your desire for God and God's desire for you? What if we haven't put anything outside of the pale of God's desire for us? What if whatever happens in your most secret, scary fantasies that you're not going to tell to anyone but God, what's happening in those? What do those tell you about who you are? Because the way we experience our desire is a part of that repertoire that Judith Butler is talking about when we constitute ourselves. What does that unlock in the depths of who you are? What if God felt the same way? That thing that you can't tell anybody else, and was willing to meet you in that? It'd be really good. We don't need to say it out loud and then have a poster that says, now you can come to this church because you think this thing. I'm just talking about what you're going to do when you go home tonight.
I shouldn't be making eye contact with anybody right now.
It's awkward, but that's okay. I think these are the swiveliest chairs.
Yeah, I know. That's
it's really hard to control them.
Do we have any wrapping up questions for Natalie? Things that you've heard tonight that might not be super clear, things that you, felt titillated by and you want to hear a little bit more about? Lydia.
A little bit more about practice.
Yeah, so students in my queer theology class, there's a few different things they can choose from among. So there are options if they want to do something that's much more practical. So there are assignments they can do that are a sermon with a reflection on it. So a sermon where they take a text that they queer, and it's a sermon that they wouldn't necessarily preach from the pulpit, but it's an experimental one. If you were to really take the theory and pull apart this and then have to preach it, how would you do that? And then they can write a reflection on why they couldn't do it that way. So what they've learned that would edge a little bit in terms of what they usually do. They can write like an education plan for doing sex education in a church for youth. And then we begin to think about, so what are the starting points? Where would you start on sex education? We would start with the question I just asked you. What's the desires inside of yourself, and where do you go from there? They can do a liturgy. They can set up a service. Again, that's queering that we do. And so we've done some really funky queer services at Emmanuel with different kinds of responses to them. And they can do it, then they can write a scholarly paper if they want to as well, going into a deep dive into something. We try to do what we can, like we use art, we use the grad students do stuff. I had a grad student who did an incredible activity during Kink Week where we all had to blindfold each other and move each other around.
I was in the building, but not in the class, and I walked down the hall when this was happening and saw them all
I was
blindfolded and
blindfolded.
leading each other, and I was like, I'm just gonna go back.
You could sub dom switch, and I was sub, and two of my students were doms, and they led me around, and we had to set rules. I had a safe word, and it was a very enlivening experience for people, and at least for me, it had an impact on my prayer life for sure.
Made it in the book.
It's in the book because they helped me figure some stuff out through that activity. Yeah, I think so. That's in the queer theology class.
You do teach other things.
Yeah, that's just one class I teach every other year. But most of my pedagogy is, most of the ways I teach are trying to orient towards multiple, to a neurodiversity kind of approach and a decolonizing approach to classroom activities. So we do a lot of experiential learning, a lot of students setting their own goals. I don't know, some of my students are in the room, so I might be talking better about my teaching than it actually is. I'm not sure.
We'll let you know afterwards. Any other questions for Natalie? Well, Natalie, thank you so much for coming all this way from the Danforth. I think when I was billing the event, I said it was going to be a stretching evening, and I think you've given us that. And you have a line in Transgressive Devotion that I quite liked. You talked about, in the book, you use a lot of paradigm-shifting images, we'll put it that way. There's some shock in there, there's some awe, but you said it's kind of like stretching. It's not so that you stay down touching your toes, it's that when you get back up, you see how far you've come. And so I think that's maybe a good way to think about this tonight, right? It's not necessarily about staying in this weird place that you've never thought about before, but when you go home, when you rest with what you've heard here, you might see just how far you've come, and I'd like to thank you for helping us make that stretching journey. So please join me and thank you.